And welcome everybody. We're going to focus tonight mostly for new graduates. And first of all, congratulations to all of you who have graduated or will be graduating shortly. But this is focused really on helping you get started with your student loan repayment plan, because usually with all the schools and BBMA groups and other SAVMA groups that we meet with on a regular basis, one of the most repeated requests is that we meet with graduates as they're leaving school and actually in a position to start repaying their loans. And this is the best that we're able to do, as you all tend to scatter as soon as you graduate. So thanks for finding the webinar and for joining us. And we're really going to focus on what you can do now during your grace period to get your loan repayment plan started, remove some of the stress associated with your student loans so you can go on to focusing on your clients full time and becoming a great veterinarian, right? So the student debt stuff is just a bit of a roadblock that stands in the way of some of that. And there's some things you can do now, maybe even before you start your first job, that can help set you up for some long-term financial success and help you pay a little bit less towards your student loans. So
one bit of housekeeping there for everybody. You guys, since we're streaming live on Facebook and here, you can go ahead and submit any questions in the Q&A or the chat or on Facebook, and we'll be gathering them and either answering them along the way if there's a lot of the similar questions, or responding to them at the end.
Yep, I will do my best to monitor some of those questions along the way, but I will try to stop at the end too and focus more on those questions, and I'm happy to stay as long as you all have questions. So feel free to jump in whenever you have one and leave it in the Q&A area, and we'll address those as we can get to them. First, before I do get started, I would like to know a little bit more about you all. So I am going to first poll you on your student debt, and for some of you, I'm gonna, this may be a shock, but I'm gonna force you to kind of look at your student debt tonight so we can start to analyze it. So I'm going to launch this poll that's going to ask you, when you enter loan repayment, what is your student loan balance going to be? That'll help me get a better idea of what we're dealing with tonight, and maybe some areas that we need to spend a little bit more time on. And while you all are answering, I'm just going to say that for the most part, some of the most common questions or the things that tend to trip people up when it comes to student loan repayment is consolidation and choosing a repayment plan. And we're going to spend a lot of time on consolidation tonight. I don't usually, when I talk to students who are not yet graduated, because quite frankly, it just is more confusing than it needs to be. And now you're actually in a position where you need to know that. And we're going to show you exactly what some of that consolidation information is going to look like. All right, so it looks like a lot of you voted, and I got about 75% of you voted here. And I'm going to end the poll in a couple seconds and share the results with you all. So we can see here that we've got a pretty even distribution here. So we got a third of the folks who are about 100 to 200,000, and close to 30% between 200 and 300, and a quarter of you all 300 to 400, and some at the higher end of the spectrum, and a few of you also at the lower end of the spectrum. So all of the stuff that we're going to talk about tonight will be able to address these balances once we start to apply some of the principles. All right, and then the second one, just to help me know what I am dealing with. Let me look for the other polls. Sorry about that. There we go. Forgot how to get there in a second. So, which best describes your anticipated student loan repayment strategy? Basically, what are you planning to do before you joined the webinar tonight to see exactly what your student loan options and strategy should be? And I think I only have 3 polling questions, so these are the first 2, and then we're going to get really into the meat of the material here. right, so I've got about, leave a few more seconds as a few more of you are trickling in some answers. All right, I'll end that poll, share the results with you. It looks like we've got at least half the people are going to use an income-driven plan. We're going to talk a lot about those tonight. Close to a quarter of you are going to pay your loans off as fast as possible, and we're going to talk about that strategy as well. We want to make sure that your income is actually going to allow you to do that, and that you're actually not going to end up paying more than you have to by using that as soon as possible strategy. And for those of you who answered honestly that you're not really sure, that's why you're here. That's what we're really going to get into next. So let's move on from the polls and talk a little bit more about consolidation, which, like we do with our medical cases, we start these by doing a history and physical exam, right? And we can apply that same clinical knowledge that you just spent the last 4 years or so obtaining for veterinary medicine to our student loan repayment strategy. So when people ask me for assistance, I ask them for their student loan history and signalment, and here's mine. So I'm a married 2-vet household with no kids. We're both Colorado State University DVMs. My wife finished in 2009 and I finished in 2012. I went as an in-state attendee for CSU, and my wife was not a state resident at CSU. She went on to specialize in small animal internal medicine, so we learned a lot about what to do and what not to do with her loans while she was doing her internship and residency. We're going to share some of that with you tonight as well, if you're planning on heading that direction. And then I went the GP route. But combined, we have a student debt total it exceeds about $400,000, right? So this is why I'm so passionate about this, and we've learned a lot, good, bad, and ugly along the way from personal experience. We're going to share some of that, and then that is translated into gathering experience from the veterinary community, from veterinarians in repayment, as well as talking to thousands of students in looking at their personal situations and helping them decide what to do. We've come up with some really good strategies. So if you do nothing after you graduate here and you enter your grace period, you have 6 months on your veterinary student loans before you technically have to do anything. And if you don't do anything, they'll put you in a standard 10-year plan. So that plan is based on the level monthly payment that would be required to pay your loan balance to zero over 10 years or 120 months. And that's based on the amount that you borrowed and your interest rate. So as an example, for my wife and I, that would have been about $4,500 a month, which was more than we were taking home at the time. So that really wasn't an option. Enter these income-driven repayment plans. So IBR is one of the income-driven repayment plans. As the name implies, your payment is a function of your income. So we ended up paying about $1,400 a month. And then a new repayment plan was released in 2015 called Revised Pay As You Earn, or Repay. And we switched over to that one, and that got us down to $930 a month. Right, so that now we have a payment that's a much more manageable percentage of our income, which means we can have a plan other than paying back our student debt. So the first place to start is the National Student Loan Data System, so the nslds.ed.gov. This is going to be the official record of your federal student loan borrowing history. I'm going to take you over there right now. And that's the great thing about these webinars, is we can actually demonstrate how you can do these. So if you go to NSLDS, you're going to see something that looks like this. And you want to hit this My Student Data Download button. You can either go in and review all of your financial aid information, which is a summary of some of that, or if you just click on this My Student Data Download button, it's going to ask you for your FSA login. So the same information that you use to apply for your student aid is the same information that'll get you into this National Student Loan Data System. And there's like a scary language that you get past, and they'll ask you to confirm this My Student Data download. Right, so this is going to generate a ugly looking text file on your desktop or your device, whatever you're using, and it's going to be this .txt. And I get a lot of folks that are hesitant to download this text file, but this is actually what you're looking for, right? And this is what I ask people to send me, this .text file, which is an ugly looking file, but we have a program in place on VIN Foundation that can take that ugly looking text file and do something meaningful with it. So save that to your desktop or your computer, and I'll show you what you can do next with that piece of information. If you have health profession student loans or loans for disadvantaged student or any other types of loans that are outside of this system, they're not going to be in that NSLDS file. So you may need to account for those separately. We're working on some ways in the VIN Foundation Student Debt Center for you guys to account for those types of loans separately. We don't have that yet. But if you know you have health profession student loans, and you can sometimes find those in your school financial aid account, just account for those separately. The nice thing is they don't have any interest that accrued during school, so you're just going to add the amount that you borrowed to the principal total, and we'll show you what to do with that later. All of the ones in the green checkbox here can be added to a federal direct consolidation loan. So anything that you find in the NSLDS file can be added, as well as health profession student loans and loans for disadvantaged students. So I mentioned that school financial aid account. It's always a good idea to check that while you still have your student credentials. So often the school will use outside loan servicers, so ACS or Heartland CSI. Those are some common ones. You may get some notifications, or maybe you already have gotten some notifications from those companies about some health profession student loans or other loans that you have with your schools that are outstanding and need to be repaid. Some clues if you're not really sure if your loan is a federal loan or a private loan. Federal loans will, at least since 2010, most of them are going to have direct in the name. So a direct Stafford unsubsidized or direct grad plus or something to that effect. So that it'll actually say direct in the name. Health profession student loans often have a variety of names. I don't know why they don't keep those consistent. Sometimes they'll just be called health student loans or veterinary professional student loans. It really depends on the school. But one of the tip-offs there is that they have a 5% fixed interest rate. So if you have a smaller principal loan that you received specifically from veterinary school, that might be a health profession student loan or a loans for disadvantaged student, and you can try to add that to a federal direct consolidation loan as well. It may be private if it doesn't have direct or Stafford somewhere in the name. If it's a variable interest rate loan, particularly in the last few years, there used to be variable interest rate loans in the federal system, but that was a long time ago. So unless you started school way back when, you're probably not going to have a federal variable interest rate student loan. So that's a tip off that it could be a private loan. And those loan names often have the bank's name in it. So Wells Fargo or Discover or Sallie Mae or something like that. The name will be in the loan. One other place that you can check is annualcreditreport.com. So you can get a free report from the three major reporting entities once a year from those Equifax, Experian, and TransUnion. All of your student loans should be on one of those reports, but not all of them will necessarily be on all three of those reports. So that's why you have to check all three, because not all student loans get reported to all of those different reporting agencies. So check all three. Again, you can do that for free once per year. It's a good habit to get into. You'll be amazed at what you'll find on there. Sometimes good, sometimes bad, but generally you want to know what's on there before a bank knows. So if you're going to go buy a house or a car or rent an apartment or even buy a practice later on and you've got some negative stuff on your credit report, you want to identify that and to get that taken care of now before you actually go to make a major purchase. So here we get into the VIN Foundation Student Debt Center, right? So now you've got that NSLDS file, and I'm going to take you over to the My Student Loans tool. So because I've been immensely frustrated with the confusion that is the federal student loan system, we came up with our own way. So with the help of with VIN and the developers at VIN and VIN Foundation, we've come up with some programs that you can use that makes this a little bit easier to understand. So we've got three different options here. You guys are well past the planning to attend school. You're now even past the still in veterinary school, and now you're going to upload your NSLDS file, that ugly looking text file that we downloaded, into this particular section here. And I'm going to show you an example of somebody, a 2019 graduate that I helped recently. This is going to take all of that information in that text file and break it down into some usable parts, things that we can do or use to make a loan repayment plan based on our situation, right? And this is really after looking at these NSLDS files for close to 10 years now. We're pulling out the pieces of information that are most useful to get started in this process. So here we see that this person borrowed $216,000, accumulated about $24,000 of interest during school, right? So that's kind of one of the ugly realities of student loans is they accrue interest while you're in school. So that's going to add to your total educational cost. Here we have the total. We do calculate a weighted average interest rate for you, which is really useful because as you'll see here, this person has 18 different loans and they all have various interest rates. So it can be extremely difficult to know which ones do I deal with first, or should I deal with them separately, or how do I even understand what my overall interest rate is? And the weighted average interest rate is the way to go, right? So we're going to take based on that principal balance for that loan and that interest rate, we're going to factor that into the equation. And if we do that for all 18 of these loans, we're going to come up with a weighted average interest rate for this portfolio of 5.83%. And that'll be important when we talk about the consolidation. The next useful piece of information in here is under this income-driven repayment eligibility tab. And so this is going to be what helps you understand which income-driven repayment options you're eligible to use. And it's all based on when you started borrowing and the types of loans that you have. So we can see here that this person is eligible for the original version of IBR, that same plan that my wife and I started out in. Pay-as-you-earn, also eligible for pay-as-you-earn because she has all direct loans and she is a new borrower as of October 1st, 2007, right? Which is great because pay-as-you-earn is probably the best repayment option out there. It's the most flexible. It's usually the least costly. There's certain exceptions to that, as there always are. But generally speaking, you're going to want to look at whether or not you qualify for pay-as-you-earn. My wife and I did not qualify for pay-as-you-earn because we did not meet this new borrower threshold, right? So that's why we use revised pay-as-you-earn, which was designed for those folks who didn't meet the new borrower qualifications under pay-as-you-earn, right? So we can see that this person qualifies for IBR, pay-as-you-earn, and revised pay-as-you-earn, so it has some choices there. The only one that she does not qualify for is the newest version of IBR, which is very, very similar to pay-as-you-earn, right? So no reason to worry there because you're probably going to pick pay-as-you-earn anyway, even if you were to qualify for the new version of IBR. So now we have our base level of understanding. You can consider this your minimum database for your student loans, right? So you've done your physical exam, you've collected all of your student loan information, you've uploaded it in here. This is kind of our minimum diagnostic information. And now we're going to start applying some of our specifics, circumstance. So whether we're married, our income, all of that type of information is going to help us to simulate that repayment strategy next, right? So we can take this information, send it over to the loan repayment simulator, and start to apply the specifics of our circumstance to figure out which one of these repayment options is going to work best for us. So we've downloaded that NSLDS file. We've uploaded it to the VIN Foundation My Student Loans tool. The income-driven repayment eligibility tab is going to help us understand which plans you can use. And then the loan repayment simulator, which we'll get into in a little while, is going to help you understand which plan you should choose. All of that's going to be contained in that VIN Foundation Student Debt Center. So we're going to move on from debt for a little bit before we formulate our treatment plan for our student loan repayment. And to do that, we're going to have to talk about income because we can't talk about student debt without talking about income. And this is where that third poll is going to come in. So this is the third and final one that I have. And this is going to help me understand whether or not those of you who want to pay your loans off as fast as possible are going to be able to do that. I'm going to peruse some of these questions while you guys are answering that poll. Well, that's a good question. And there's a question in here about the annualcreditreport.com. Do I have to provide my social security number in order to access my credit report from the website you showed? I believe you do. But that, because a lot of the accounts that you're going to have open are going to be tied to your social security number, so you're going to have to provide that information.
Yeah, you absolutely, Tony, I'm just going to weigh in here. You absolutely will. That's the only way that your credit report is tracked, is by identifying you as through your social security number. And you know, a lot of people use freecreditreport.com. So while I understand that identity can be a concern, I think, you know, we're not going to say that we 100% vouch for it, but we will say that it's an easy place for you to gain access to that information. And so just sort of some info there.
All right, great. Thanks for that. So here's what you guys indicated as your income. So I can see, based on some of the lower ones, that we probably got some internship residency goers there. The most popular, and it looks like we have a bit of a bell curve here, kind of like we see with the AVMA annual reports. So centered around that, somewhere between that $70,000 and $90,000 starting salary. So that's going to help us understand whether or not our student loan repayment strategy is appropriate, right? So now we're going to take our student debt and we're going to divide it by our income to get a student debt to income ratio. So our student debt to income ratio is going to help us make some decisions about the treatment plans that are available. So if your debt to income ratio is less than or equal to 1, right? So if your income is going to be greater or equal to what your student debt balance is, then you are likely to pay your loans off before you reach any sort of forgiveness under an income-driven repayment plan. You can choose to use them as you're getting started. It's still probably not a bad idea, especially if you're not sure when your debt to income ratio might be less than or equal to 1, or if it's going to be in a couple of years. Those are times when you can use income-driven repayment in the short term to help get a jump start on your finances and still save some money on your student loan repayment plan. This is also when private refinances can help, right? Is when your income exceeds your debt, that's when lowering your interest rate can actually save you money on your overall loan repayment strategy. However, if you anticipate that your debt is going to be greater than your income, and based on the debt numbers that you reported to me earlier and some of the income numbers I've seen here, it's highly likely that your debt exceeds your income. So you have a debt to income ratio that's greater than 1. And in that case, you're going to want to start a federal direct consolidation loan, choose an income-driven repayment plan, and pay the minimum, at least in the short term, and see what your income does after that. And if you start to run simulations, and I'm going to get ahead of myself here a little bit, but if you start to run simulations based on your income, your family size, your spouse information, and each time you run a simulation, you keep hitting a forgiven amount in the loan repayment simulator, then you're going to want to pay the minimum and plan for the forgiveness. And because these payments take into account your income and your family situation, as all of that changes over time, your loan repayment strategy can change over time. So you have to reassess this each year. But the good news or bad news is that you're going to have to renew your income documentation each year. So that's a great time to reassess that repayment strategy. So why do you want to consolidate your student loans using a federal direct consolidation loan? And as we advertised in the emails that you all received, it can help save you time and money. And the earlier, the better. So this is the perfect opportunity to do this because this is the earliest that you can start the consolidation process. Your loans have to be in their grace period in order for you to start this. But if you can get your loans consolidated, or when you can get your loans consolidated, you can actually end your grace period. It's the only way to end your grace period early. And why would you want to do that? Because most of you are still accruing interest during your grace period. And if you let your grace period run its course, you're going to add more interest to that unpaid interest balance, which is going to get added to your starting principal. And your starting principal is going to determine how much interest and your total repayment cost for the duration of repayment. So the higher that starting repayment balance is, the more you're going to pay, right? So you want to get your starting repayment balance set as soon as possible. And the only way to do that is through the consolidation process, which allows you to end your grace period early. It also allows you to apply for income-driven repayment. If you make some payments during the grace period, they really don't count towards anything. They're going to shave off some interest, but if you're going to end up hitting forgiveness anyway, that's really not going to be very beneficial. So you want to get officially entered into an income-driven repayment, because then those payments can actually count towards forgiveness. If you get the forgiveness clock starting sooner, then you may hit forgiveness sooner, which means you'll pay less on your student loans, right? So that's how it can save you time, is you get that clock starting sooner, which means you're in repayment for a shorter period of time, and it'll save you money because the shorter you're in repayment, the less you'll pay overall. And if you do this before you start your job or internship, you can even qualify for a $0 per month minimum payment, because as part of the consolidation application, they're going to ask you, what do you want to do with your loans after the consolidation is complete? If your answer is to use an income-driven repayment plan, they're going to ask you, well, what's your income? And if your income is zero during that period between school and when you start your job or internship, you can say that my current income is zero, or you can even use your previous tax return from the fourth year of vet school, which is probably close to zero, and they'll set your payment to zero for the next 12 months. That buys you some time on your student loans. It gets the clock ticking towards forgiveness. If you anticipate hitting it, you have more time and budgetary flexibility to learn how to become a veterinarian in your new role, whether that's an internship or you're moving to a place that you've never lived before and you're not really sure what to expect. You're going to need a little bit of flexibility, and this can really help you achieve that. It also allows you to choose your loan servicer, which we're going to talk about a little bit here. But generally speaking, I put them on a spectrum of terrible, right? And unfortunately, none of the loan servicers are very good. Now, these are private companies that the government contracts with that are going to be responsible for taking your payments and helping you along the way, right? And I'm going to say helping in as loose a term as I possibly can, because essentially they're probably going to be a big pain in your butt. So these are the folks that you're going to have to deal with when you provide your income documentation. They often make errors. They're going to tell you things that sometimes aren't even true when it comes to income-driven repayment. So this is one of the reasons why we do some of this stuff, is to help minimize some of the stress and confusion around dealing with your loan servicers and make sure that you have a foundation of information that you can lean on if they tell you something that doesn't sound quite right. So the spectrum of terrible with loan servicers are concerned. Fed loan servicing is, I'll say that they're the least terrible, right? And they're the one that you should choose as part of this consolidation process. If you already have them, great. You'll see that in the NSLDS file as well. You can choose them to keep your loans. But if you have Navient or Nelnet, I would really want to start the consolidation process so I can move those loans away from those loan servicers. They're just, there's too many situations where they are a significant source of frustration. And Navient's even being sued by a number of states, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, for just generally being terrible at servicing your loans. So you don't want to work with somebody that doesn't want to work with you. So choose the least terrible option, and know that you're still going to have to watch these folks closely as they process your information, because all of the mistakes that they make end up costing you money, right? So choose the ones that are at least the most experienced doing this. And Fed Loan Servicing, they're the official servicer for public service loan forgiveness. So if you're working towards public service loan forgiveness, or think you may end up in a nonprofit 501c3 or state federal veterinary position in the future, they're going to move your loans over to Fed Loan Servicing anyway. So better to do it now than after you're already in repayment, because that's when mistakes can get made as well, is during that repayment process. If they have to move your loans midstream, a lot of times information gets lost in that translation. You don't have to consolidate, right? So this is a voluntary process on your part, and there is a little bit of admin. You're going to have to watch this go through along the way. If you have health proficient student loans or Perkins loans, you're going to lose that longer grace period, the interest-free period, but that usually is outweighed by all of the pros that are listed above. You also lose the option to target certain loans. Some people find that to be beneficial, right? But most people would rather not have 18 student loans or 25 student loans. They'd rather have one or two. It's just easier. You have a single loan servicer to deal with, less chances of mistakes, and the payments are easier to apply across a single loan than they are across dozens of loans.
So Tony, we're getting a couple people are just asking a question. What if your income equals your debt in regards to consolidation? What would you suggest?
If your income equals your debt, you can still use the opportunity, the fact that you haven't started your job yet, to buy yourself some flexibility. So you can still use income-driven repayment to get that $0 payment for the first 12 months. You might lean towards revised pay-as-you-earn. We'll talk a little bit more about that later, but you can see that in the simulator. When you're closer to that debt-to-income ratio of 1, you'll often see that revised pay-as-you-earn will be the least most expensive repayment option, and that's because your payment increases as your income increases. And when your debt-to-income ratio is 1 or less, you'll often have the repay payment be a little bit more than the standard 10-year payment. So you can end up paying your balance to zero sooner than you would under a standard 10-year plan, which would be less expensive. Right? So for those folks in that situation, I tend to look a little bit more towards repay, particularly as I'm getting started, and I let my income dictate how much I pay towards my student loans. So how do I start a federal direct consolidation loan? Right, so first of all, your grace period must have started. So you're going to see that in the NSLDS file. You're also going to see that in the My Student Loans upload. So I'm going to show you a sample of what that looks like. So we can actually see that here in the one that we uploaded initially. I can see that this person's loans are listed in the grace period as of May 4th, 2019. Right, and that's what I'm looking for, right, is that the direct unsubsidized loan makes it into the grace period. That means that it's going to be easier to start the consolidation process. I'm going to see some other statuses in these loans as well, and that's when I can go to the loan types and look at some of the other information. So here's those direct Stafford unsubsidized loans. I'm looking for grace period or some other evidence that they've been in repayment. This just means that this loan has already exhausted its previous grace period and was already in repayment at one point. That means that I can consolidate those as well. Direct plus graduate loans, they never really hit a grace period. They're always in deferment, but you can always consolidate a loan that's in deferment. So you're not looking for a grace period on those types of loans. You're just looking for deferment. And here I can see also that these loans, these are some older loans, probably from an undergrad or pre-veterinary school education. And the fact that they've already been in repayment once means that I can consolidate them and add them to my direct consolidation loan. So that's the My Student Loans piece. Now we can go over to studentloans.gov. So this again is an area that you can log into using that same FSA ID that you use to apply for your student loans while you were in veterinary school. You're going to have a number of options here. So you're looking for the repayment and consolidation piece. Here we have a consolidation loan application and promissory note. That's the one that you're looking for. We're going to click on that, and I can actually do, I can log in here, and I can take you so far anyway, because I don't want to consolidate my loans because I've already consolidated them after I graduated vet school. So now that I'm in here, it gives you a little bit of information. What is a loan consolidation? It'll tell you most people complete the process in less than 30 minutes, right? So who should complete this? What do I need? You can download a complete version of a written copy of it, or you can start it electronically. It's really easy to do electronically, right? So here you see the remaining loans that I have. I have a couple with Navient with small balances. I keep them just so I can keep an eye on them for research purposes. And I can tell you that they're pretty terrible at this, but you can find all over the internet that they're pretty terrible. So here we're going to come down to the grace period section, right? So I get a lot of questions about how do I end my grace period early, right? So here you're going to see this processing delay, right? How long do you want them to sit on this consolidation application? And the answer is you don't want them to sit on it at all, right? So you want to do this delay, do not delay processing. So if you select that, once the consolidation is complete, they've identified all the loans that you put in the application and they've actually paid those loans off with this new loan, then your loan will go into repayment 30 days after that. So here it says that your servicer will begin processing your application upon receipt. So here's where you get to the servicer selection section, right? And this is a little bit misleading, but they ask you if you've ever been or are you planning to be employed full-time by a public service organization. And this is particularly for public service loan forgiveness. Whether you say yes or no here really doesn't matter. They're still going to give you an option to choose from the list of loan servicers that are available here. And you want to choose this Fed Loan Servicing FIA, as they are known, as that's the one that officially monitors public service loan forgiveness and is generally the least terrible. Although if you Google them, you're going to find horrible stories about Fed Loan Servicing too. But the fact that they have to monitor public service loan forgiveness full time means that they have to be a little bit better with income-driven repayment, because that's one of the requirements for achieving public service loan forgiveness. So that's why I recommend them. It doesn't mean that they're going to be good, and it doesn't mean it's going to be roses every time that you call them. It doesn't even mean that they're not going to make any mistakes. It just means that they should be more familiar with the income-driven repayment process than any of the other loan servicers. Then we can move on to the next one. So let's see what happens if I don't think I'll break anything by doing that. So it's going to, this is where it's going to ask you a little bit more information about your family size and status, gives you some idea of how much your loan repayment options are going to cost you in total and per month. And then down towards the bottom here, this is where they ask you, what repayment plan do you want us to use when the consolidation is complete? And by this point, after you've run some simulations using the VIN Foundation Student Loan Repayment Simulator, you can choose one of these options that are available. The consolidation will take 30 to 60 days to complete. Should be closer to 30 by the time that they finish that. If not all of your loans are eligible to be entered into the consolidation, you have 180 days to add other loans to that. So common scenarios where that might be the case. You've graduated and your loans are not listed in the grace period yet, right? That's pretty common actually. If you graduated, say, May 15th, your loans may not say grace period until June 1st. And that's okay, right? You can either wait to start the consolidation on June 1st, or if you have some other loans that actually can be added to that consolidation, you can start it now and add those loans once they do enter their grace period, right? So you have 180 days from the time that that consolidation is completed to add additional loans that may not have been eligible to be added when you first started it. Health profession student loans are notorious for this too. Sometimes they don't enter their grace period officially until a few months after you graduate. So you'll just have to set some calendar reminders to add those oddball loans that are outside of that system to make sure that they make it into your consolidation within that 180 days. So get the consolidation started. All of your loans that you've borrowed for veterinary school or prior to veterinary school should be in their grace period or be eligible to be consolidated at least within 180 days of graduation. So we can't talk about the federal consolidation without mentioning private consolidation, right? So that is often confusing because you're going to, if you haven't already started receiving them, they're pretty aggressive about advertising to you. So you're going to get a lot of post mail, a lot of email, a lot of phone calls about consolidating your student loans. And it can be very risky, right? So when it can work is when you're refinancing less beneficial private student loans, Right? So if you have some private student loans from undergrad, or you acquired some in between undergrad and vet school, or maybe even some from vet school, if those interest rates are not very favorable, this is a great time to explore a private refinance of those less beneficial private loans. But usually you're not going to want to do that until you start working and actually have some income documentation to show them and a little bit of a credit history, right? So the better your credit history and the higher your income, the better chance of getting a more beneficial interest rate on a private loan refinance. This also brings up what we talked about earlier, and the question that Jordan brought up is, what if your debt to income ratio is about 1-to-1, right? This is where a private refi can work, but right out of the gate, I would be really reluctant to do that with my federal student loans, right? That first year or two of veterinary medicine, of practicing, is extremely volatile, right? We know that there's a high level of turnover. A lot of folks, the first job that they take is not the job that they stick in. And if that is you, then you're going to want to have some flexibility, right? So moving is expensive. Finding a new job is expensive. If you don't have a lot of income or emergency reserves to live off during those times, then you might be stuck with a higher student loan payment than your income can service. If you're using income-driven repayment, not only is your payment zero for those first 12 months if you got it submitted before you started your first job, but if your income goes down because you switch jobs, then you can submit to have your payment recalculated, and that payment would go down to zero. Right? There's some huge flexibility there in terms of giving you that option to switch jobs if you need to, or just buys you some time to understand what your actual earnings are going to be as you learn to be a proficient practicing veterinarian.
So one question, Tony, is someone's asking how you feel about refi companies such as SoFi.
Yeah, I don't. I really don't feel. I think that they market heavily, right? So, and it is an option, but make sure that you're a candidate for that, right? You have to know what you're getting into, which means you have to understand those contracts that they're sending you. They're all different, right? So they're becoming more consistent, but a lot of them are based on your credit score, your income, whether or not you're bringing a cosigner to the table. I mean, they're highly individualized, right? So you have to be able to analyze that offer that they're giving you and know that it's a good offer for you, right? So it's just not just about an interest rate. It's about you being able to understand whether or not that's going to put you in a better or worse position than you're currently in. And in most cases, private student loan refinances are less flexible and less favorable than the terms and conditions that you have with your federal student loans. You might be able to get a lower interest rate, but again, if it's a quarter or a half a point lower, that's really not going to be enough to justify giving up all of the flexibility that you have with your federal student loans. So know what you're getting know what you're getting into, and how to compare the costs, right? So that's another area where you can use the VIN Foundation Loan Repayment Simulator to see how much is this payment going to cost me if I refi my student loans with a private lender, right? Just because they give you a lower interest rate doesn't mean your payment's going to be lower. In many cases, it's going to be higher, right? You may pay less in total over time, but you're paying more per month, right? And that might not be the best position to be in when you don't necessarily know how much you're going to be earning per month, or how much you have after taxes and your other essential living expenses before you have to deal with this monthly student loan payment, right? So you really want to know what your after-tax take-home pay is and what percentage of that is going to be dedicated to your student loans before you pull the trigger on a private loan refi. You also want to know if they're going to require your spouse to co-sign on that. Oftentimes, they will entice your spouse or some other family member to sign on that loan to lower the interest rate for you. And if something should happen to you, they're going to come after that other person, right? That's not the case for your federal student loans, right? If something should happen to you and you're no longer able to pay, or, the worst should happen and you should disappear, your loans disappear with you, right? And nobody else in your family is responsible for covering your federal student loans. And that's not always the case with private student loans. We'll talk about the,
a couple more questions. I just want to confirm that coming up, we'll talk about forgiveness and public loan service forgiveness as well.
Yep, absolutely. So we're going to get into that when we start talking about the income-driven repayment plans, and that's coming up.
Wonderful. Hang on, guys. It's coming.
It's coming up right here. So a couple of things I want to address before we get to the repayment options for those of you that are going on to do internships or plan on having kids, or we've already talked about the job change, but there is a knee-jerk reaction, almost a reflex reaction in the medical professions to defer your loans. And I'm going to encourage you to not defer your loans, right? Because deferment, all it does is it takes your payment down to zero, but all of that interest that accrues during that deferment gets added to your principal. That's a process called capitalization. So that's going to add to your principal, which is going to add to your total repayment costs, which is going to cost you more money in the long run. A better option, particularly during those internships and maternity leave, is to either choose income-driven repayment or have your payment recalculated lower if you're already using income-driven repayment. So that in the case of maternity leave, if you're going to go on unpaid maternity leave and you're already using income-driven repayment, you can have your payment reduced to zero if it's not already there, right? So you can have your payment reduced to zero once you go on unpaid maternity leave. And that's better than using deferment, because when you come out of deferment, they won't add that interest to your principal. So the capitalization won't happen like it does under deferment or forbearance for that matter, right? So there's really no reason to ever use deferment or forbearance anymore. Income-driven repayment has made those provisions obsolete. If your income is low enough to generate a $0 payment, you can have a $0 payment under income-driven repayment. It still counts towards forgiveness. It still counts towards public service loan forgiveness if you're working towards it. And the unpaid interest that accrues during that time will not get added to your principal, right? So it'll decrease the amount that you pay towards your student loans, and it still keeps the clock ticking towards forgiveness. So public service announcements: colleagues don't let other colleagues defer their loans. So if you're going to work with other veterinarians alongside you in an internship that haven't seen this webinar, refer them over to it or tell them not to defer their loans, to use income-driven repayment. They will save tens of thousands of dollars in the long run. If you're heading back to do an academic residency, MPH, PhD, beware of the student loan auto deferment. Right? So the system is set up to recognize if you're back in school at least half time. So just like when you went to vet school, if you had loans from undergrad, they automatically deferred those loans. They will do that again with your vet school loans if you go do a residency that requires a master's of clinical science or something like that. Right? So you want to decline that automatic deferment and keep your loans in that income-driven repayment plan. It can be based on your income, so it'll be a small percentage of that small income that you're earning during that period, but you'll still keep the clock ticking. And those payments may even be eligible for public service loan forgiveness if you're doing those at an academic institution. Right? So keep your loans in income-driven repayment. You need to know this ahead of time, right? So the system is set up to automatically defer your loans once it recognizes you're back in school. So you'll have to call them ahead of time before that program starts and tell them, look, I expect you to receive notification that I'm back in school, but I want to ignore that and keep my loans in repayment. All right, so here we go, income-driven repayment. So here are the options that are available. We're going to focus on these ones in the green check mark. Those are the ones that are built into the VIN Foundation Loan Repayment Simulator, because these are the most beneficial options that are available. So first step, taking that NSLDS file, putting it in My Student Loans, making sure that you can consolidate your loans, and then sending over those loans to the Loan Repayment Simulator and filling in the details from there. If your debt to income ratio is going to be greater than 1, end your grace period, choose your loan servicer, choose your repayment plan. Right? And if you time this right, you're going to have a $0 payment for the first 12 months, and you're going to have that flexibility to get to know your budget and understand better how much money you're going to earn as a veterinarian, particularly in that first year. And if you're going to end up hitting forgiveness, you want that $0 payment for the first 12 months because it's going to save you money in total in your total loan repayment costs.
One question, Tony, someone's asking, during the consolidation process, do they have the option to change the loan service provider? If they have somebody and they want to change it, are they able to?
Consolidation is the only time that you're able to choose your loan servicer. So if you want the ability to choose a new loan servicer, then consolidate your student loans. It's not the only reason to consolidate your student loans. We covered a lot of other good reasons for doing that, but being able to choose your loan servicer, that's the only opportunity you have, is during that consolidation process. Otherwise, you're stuck with the one that you have. The only exception to that is if you are working towards public service loan forgiveness. If you submit one of the public service loan forgiveness employment certification forms and you're eligible, they will move your loans over to Fed loan servicing. Right? So that's the only other way to have your loans moved to a new servicer voluntarily. Right? So choose your loan servicer during that consolidation process. Choose Fed loan servicing. They're probably going to be the least terrible of the bunch of loan servicers. So common questions that come up: my student debt is approximately $150,000. Should I even consider using an income-driven plan? That relates back to the question that Jordan brought up earlier. Is my debt to income ratio 1-to-1, close to 1-to-1, maybe a little bit higher than 1, but not quite 2? But in my opinion, you should definitely get started in income-driven repayment because that's probably still going to be the least costly option. And we can show you that through another example that I have. So I'm going to upload a different example of a lower student debt situation just to illustrate this point. So this is somebody who has about $120,000 of direct loans, but then has $13,500 in health profession student loans. And those health profession student loans, as I talked about earlier, are not going to show up in here. Right, so we have the $120,000 of direct loans. Looks like they had a Perkins loan that had been paid off previously. We have $12,000 of interest. I have to add the additional $13,000 or $13,500 of health profession student loans. I have my weighted average interest rate. I see that this person qualifies for all of the income-driven plans. So I'm going to send this information over to the loan repayment simulator. Right, so I'm going to add this 13,500 to here, which is going to end up getting me to about 133, we'll call it 134 for ease of math and illustration. And then I'll change this back to, there was about 13,000 of unpaid interest there. Average interest rate is 5.94. So one of the benefits of consolidating, so you may not see it as a benefit yet, but they're going to do a weighted average interest and they're going to round it up to the nearest 1/8 of 1%, right? So in this case, her interest rate would get rounded up to 6%. But after you're in repayment, you can set up auto pay and get a 0.25 interest rate deduction, right? So that's another thing that you can do once you're in repayment. So that'll knock this down to 5.75, which was lower than the weighted average interest rate that we calculated. Even if your minimum monthly payment is 0, they will let you sign up for auto pay and they'll still give you a 0.25% interest rate reduction. So even if your payment is 0 for the first 12 months, sign up for that auto pay so you can get that 0.25% interest rate reduction. It may not seem like a lot, but over the course of 20 or 25 years, it can be a pretty big deal. So let's not assume an internship here for this person. Let's say that their income is closer to what we saw on the average there. I'm going to assume that they do this as we've been recommending, right? So they get the $0 payment for the first year. So I'm going to put 0 in for that first year of income. And then the following year, when they go to renew, maybe they've been producing a little bit more and their income is increased. So we end up with a higher amount of annualized income that we'll use when we renew the following year. Family information, right? Are you married? Yes, no, not yet, right? So that's all going to factor in to your repayment plan and the costs, whether or not you have children now or in the future, right? Those are all going to factor in to the calculation that they use to figure in your payment. We can run this simulation. And what I'm looking for here, or what I'm testing for here, is my starting repayment balance, the monthly payment amount, right? $1,600 a month if I want to pay this loan to zero in 10 years or less, probably going to be pretty difficult, right? And also unnecessary. I can have a $0 payment using something like pay as you earn, which is generally the most flexible. And just because the total repayment cost here comes out higher than the standard 10-year doesn't mean that I should automatically use the standard 10-year, right? Because this is a tough thing to do, especially as I'm getting started. So once I have a better understanding of my income, I may increase how much I pay towards my student loans, but if it's not going to end up preventing me from hitting forgiveness, then there's no reason to do it, right? So I may pay a little bit more, but I'm also paying over a much longer period of time, and it's not that much more. So when I come down here to my forgiveness planning module, I end up factoring in my forgiveness savings plan. So I end up paying essentially the same amount as I would under a standard 10-year plan, but I'm doing it over 20 years, right? And I'm doing it with a percentage of my income, which gives me much more money in my pocket, in my budget each month that I can do other things with, right? So building an emergency fund, saving for retirement, buying a home, starting a family, buying a practice, all of these things that we probably are looking forward to doing with our lives, and not having to worry so much about paying my student loans faster than my income allows, right? And this is a lower starting student debt scenario, right? And this is still a case for using income-driven repayment over something like a standard 10-year plan. So let's come back here. How am I going to pay off $300,000 worth of student debt? The higher the starting balance, the more likely that income-driven repayment is going to be a no-brainer, right? The difficult part becomes planning for forgiveness. So I have another example here that has a higher student debt total that we can use. Actually, I think we can just use this one. I'm going to send this over. This isn't quite 300, but it is approaching a little bit higher number here, so getting a little closer to 250. So this is, in this instance, if she consolidates her loan, her weighted average interest rate, again, is going to get increased by that 1/8 of 1%. So it's going to go up to 5.875. And if you subtract off 0.25 from that, you're going to get an interest rate of about 5.63. So we can change that, assuming that we signed up for auto pay. We'll make some similar assumptions here. We'll get that $0 payment in the first 12 months. You can choose how fast your income is going to increase. This is where the AVMA has some good data, right? So you can actually go to the AVMA new grad myveterinarylife.org, and they have a financial section there, and you can put in where you're living, where you're practicing, the type of practice that you're pursuing, and it'll give you an idea of how much folks are earning 1 year out, 2 years out, 5 years out, and you can see what that income might be for you, or you can get a sense of that as you're working as a veterinarian and see what your earning potential is and fill in those numbers appropriately. Same with your family information. If you do select a spouse, right, you can do not yet and choose a year when you're going to get married. Let's say it's going to be next year. Then you can choose how you're going to differ your tax filing status, because that'll have a major impact on your student loan repayment planning. Let's see what your spouse's income is, whether they're another veterinarian or somebody else that's not in the veterinary field. Do they have student debt? That is something that'll also factor into this equation. So maybe they have some undergrad debt of their own at a little bit lower interest rate that they're using a various set of repayment options for, and how long they've been in repayment. And then maybe you're going to add some children in the future, right? So this all can help you understand what your loan repayment costs are going to be. And I'm going to file jointly here just for some illustration points. We can see that based on this simulation, if we're going to count our spouse's income because we filed our taxes jointly, we're going to end up with a little bit higher student loan repayment costs. Again, I'm looking at pay as you earn, especially when you qualify for it. Here I see that that one's a little bit higher, but it's much lower than the other options that are available except for that standard 10. But now if we go up here and separate our income from our spouse, assuming that we file our taxes separately, now we can see that the story changes dramatically, right? So this total repayment cost went down by nearly $100,000 just based on how we chose to file our taxes, right? So if we factor in our forgiveness plan, now we're even less than that. And now we're nearly $100,000 less expensive than even a standard 10-year plan, right? So how you choose to file your taxes when you're married or if you're married can have a major impact on your student loan repayment plan, right? So it may be great that you're a dual income earning household, but it doesn't mean you necessarily have to pay more towards your student loans, right? So you're going to have to work through that exercise to see if there's, like in this case, more than $140,000 on the table if you file your taxes separately and pay only based on your student loans for the duration of repayment. Now, you do have to save enough to cover that tax that's due, right? So the less you pay towards your student loans, the more gets forgiven, right? And we have about $110,000 of taxes projected 20 years from now, which I can save for by allocating $335 a month in an account that yields 3% per year for those 20 years. And if I do that, I will have the $110,000 on hand that I need to cover the forgiveness. And that lowers our total repayment costs. I wanted to round back to this effective interest rate. So if we do this, right, so this person borrowed about $216,000 total, right, but plus the interest that accrued during school, had a starting repayment balance of $240. So our starting repayment balance was $240,581. 20 years later, if we paid $223,949, that means we ended up paying effectively 0.17% of interest per year, right? Even though our stated interest rate is 5.63%, right? Because these income-driven plans, they don't necessarily care so much about how much you borrowed as they care about how much you earn, as well as your family size. So all things being equal, your income will determine how much you end up paying towards your student loans. And it could be that the amount that you earn over the next 20 years that you're paying your student loans ends up dictating that you pay about the amount that you borrowed, right? In this case, that's what we're showing, right? So that's what we're talking about when we mention know what you're giving up when you compare it against a private loan refinance. Because if somebody came to you and said, hey, well, we'll refinance your student loans at 4.5% for 15 years, right? Well, first of all, that payment's probably going to be $3,000 a month, and they are probably still going to end up paying more than what they would have paid using pay as you earn. Because no private lender is going to refinance your student loans at 0.17%. Right? So you have to know how to evaluate this, and you don't want to end up putting yourself in a worse cash flow position just so you could end up paying more towards your student loans than you could have if you understood how the income-driven repayment plans worked. So best repayment option for a new grad who wants to buy a practice shortly after graduation, right? You're going to need money. You're going to need cash. And if you're putting too much of your cash towards your student loans, then you're not going to have a lot of money available to put down towards the purchase of a practice or to start a practice if you're going to start one on your own, right? So you want to have as much cash flow flexibility as you can. If you're buying a practice, they're going to want to see that you don't have to dedicate a significant amount of your income towards your student loan payment. If you're using income-driven repayment, which sets your payment to 10% of your discretionary income, then you can have a manageable student loan payment and you'll look like a better borrowing candidate, right? So those are all good reasons to use income-driven repayment to help you meet your goals, no matter which of these scenarios that you find yourself in. So consolidate, end your grace period early, get into that income-driven repayment plan. Your income documentation, just to kind of put a bow on some of the logistical information here, they will take a tax return that is no more than 2 years old, right? So they'll take the adjusted gross income, the AGI, from a recent tax return, and a recent tax return is one that you filed within the last 2 years. They will also take that zero taxable income, right? So you can check the box that says, I do not have any taxable income if that's your current situation at the time of application, and they will set your payment to zero for the first 12 months. Or you can use a pay stub, offer letter, some other kind of income documentation to document what it is your income will be. I saw somebody raise a hand here in the webinar chat. So let me see if I can find that.
I think those questions, Tony, are going into the chat or the Q&A, so I'm keeping track of it if you want to keep going.
Okay. I don't see what the question was for the person who raised their hand, so I'm sorry. I'll have to come back to that one maybe later. But in terms of documenting your income, so you can use that tax return, you can use the zero taxable income box, or you can use any other documentation that you have that you're currently able to provide or that they request of you. Your spouse will almost always count if you're married. Anyone else who lives with you, that you provide 50% or more of their living expenses. So if you have an elderly dependent or somebody else who's living with you, they will count in your family size. And if you are pregnant and you know that you're pregnant, you can also count that future child in your family size for student loan repayment purposes. So there's two ways to provide that income documentation. One is via studentloans.gov, right? So if you do the whole process, so you start the consolidation, which we started at studentloans.gov, you choose that you're going to use an income-driven repayment option, you're still in studentloans.gov, they will ask if they can link to your most recent tax return. If you don't have one on file, then you can indicate that I don't have any zero taxable income if that's your current situation, or you're going to have to provide alternative documentation of income. That's where you have to deal directly with your loan servicer, right? So they will take a recent tax return, they will take that document that says you have zero taxable income, but you don't have to go through them for that. But if you don't have one of those two available or those situations don't apply to you, then you're going to have to use a pay stub or some kind of offer letter or W-2 or other piece of information that says what your taxable income situation might be. If you go through your loan servicers, document everything. Double check their math, use the loan repayment simulator. I'm going to show you the discretionary income calculation. It's really simple. Just do a back of the napkin check on the calculation that they come up with, because they make a ton of mistakes, right? And they're usually not in your favor. So you want to make sure that they're doing you right when you apply for income-driven repayment. So your income-driven repayment amount due is a percent of your discretionary income. And discretionary income is defined as your taxable income less 150% of the federal poverty guidelines. And you can look those up. They get updated every year. If you use pay-as-you-earn or revised pay-as-you-earn, or even the new version of IBR, your payment is 10% of that discretionary income. So if you have $85,000 of taxable income and a family size of 1, they're going to take your $85,000, they're going to subtract off this allowance, this 150% of the federal poverty guidelines for a family size of 1, which is $12,490. Your discretionary income is $66,265. If we take 10% of that number and divide it by 12, that's how we get a monthly payment, right? So $552 per month. That's what your taxable income and family size requires you to pay. There's really no reason to pay any more than that if your income doesn't require it. I see a question that I'm going to jump on there about discretionary income. Can I use my tax return if my income then was significantly less than it is now, or do I need to use my pay stub instead? So they will ask you that question. So when you go through the application and let's say you do have a tax return on file and they pull that information in, the next question they're going to ask is, has your income changed significantly since you filed this most recent tax return? Now it's up to you to figure out whether or not your income has significantly changed. What is significantly, right? I mean, that's a tough question to answer. So that's going to be up to you, whether or not you can support the answer that you come up with. And if somebody were to call you on it, how would you justify that, right? So if your income has significantly changed, right? So if it has increased and you're not comfortable providing your most recent tax return because you can't sleep at night by checking that box, then you will have to provide them a pay stub that more accurately reflects your current taxable income. And that pay stub can't be any more than 90 days old, right? So you're going to have to use more recent income documentation, and then they will base your payment on that. Conversely, let's say that your tax return from last year is higher than what you're earning now. So maybe you're on unpaid, you had an unpaid maternity leave during that time, or you're currently on one, and you're not earning nearly as much as you earned last year. Well, now you can say that either I don't have taxable income, or provide them some other documentation that shows that your income is lower than your previous tax return showed that it was, right? So those are different ways that you can answer those questions and try to get the payment that most closely reflects your current taxable income situation. Should I pay more than the minimum? So generally, no, right? And that's really frustrating. So especially if you keep running simulations, and I see a couple of questions there about what if my income jumps significantly? And again, what is significantly, right? Until your income jumps to something that is above your student debt balance, paying more than the minimum generally doesn't make any sense, right? And then it's going to depend on when your income may reach that amount, right? So if you keep running simulations, and the simulator will show this, right? If you keep running simulations and you keep hitting forgiveness, paying more than the minimum is just going to be wasting money, right? You're going to end up saving more if you paid the minimum and plan for the eventual tax that's due on forgiveness. You'll have more money available to you, which means you'll have more options to use that money in a better way than paying additional funds towards your student loans. So let your income dictate your payment. You don't owe more than 10 to 15% of your discretionary income. That's what the rules require. So if 10 or 15% of your income pays your balance to zero before you reach forgiveness, great, right? Congratulations. Then you don't have to worry about paying the tax when it comes due. However, if 10 to 15% of your income results in a balance forgiven, that's fine as well, right? Just be prepared for it. There's no right or wrong way to do this. Do the one that's going to give you the most cash flow flexibility and hopefully the lowest total repayment cost, right? Generally speaking, I just let my income determine that. And if I pay it to zero before I hit forgiveness, wonderful. If not, just as wonderful. I'm just going to make sure that I'm prepared for that forgiveness. So let's cover marriage a little bit, right? So I showed that a little bit in the simulator. How can that affect your repayment? So if you're married, so they're going to ask you, are you married? And if you say yes, right, then they're going to ask you for your spouse's income documentation, unless the most recent tax return that you filed as married filing separately. And that's specifically for income-based repayment and pay as you earn. If you filed your most recent tax return as married filing separately, then you do not have to provide your spouse's income documentation. It's going to be up to you to figure out if it's going to cost you more in taxes to file separately than you're going to save in your student loan repayment savings. And that's where we used that example in the loan repayment simulator that showed, if we go back up here and say that we file jointly and we looked at our total loan repayment costs under pay as you earn, I saw a cost of $360. I'm going to use the forgiveness planning module cost because I'm going to hit forgiveness. So that's about $344 as a conservative estimate. as a total loan repayment cost. I'm going to go back up here and file separately, right? We're not going to tell you how much it's going to cost you to file your taxes separately, but we can tell you the difference in your loan repayment cost. So it was $340 was our forgiveness planning module cost filing jointly. It's $224 filing separately. So nearly $120,000 difference. So you have to find out, either using an accountant or using some tax filing software, if you think it's going to cost you the equivalent of $120,000 to file your taxes separately over 20 years. The answer is probably no, right? Which means it's going to favor filing your taxes separately and sticking with pay as you earn, paying the minimum, and planning for the forgiveness. You're going to want to work through that tax filing cost piece with an accountant or using some tax filing software to confirm that. Sometimes they're not always that drastic of a difference, but that's what the loan repayment simulator is there for. So you can enter those numbers, those differences in your situation, and see what the differences come out to for you. I see a request for some examples with some higher debt, starting debt. I can do that here as well. So let's assume that you have something closer to a $350,000 starting repayment balance. And we had some of you that indicated that in our debt poll in the beginning. And let's use an internship year. We'll assume that maybe you're going to earn a little bit more after your internship year, even if you use your internship income, right? So we'll do the same kind of married assumptions here. I'll have the filing separately. And what you'll notice is you'll start to see is that it becomes more of a no-brainer. When you have a starting balance that's higher, and when I say higher, I'm going to use debt to income ratio as my gauge. If your debt to income ratio is 2 or greater, then quite often, almost all of the time, income-driven repayment is going to end up being the least costly of your options. That can change if your income significantly increases during that repayment period, but it's going to have to go up quite high quite soon in order for that to happen. And not to say that can happen in veterinary medicine. There are opportunities for that to happen, but on average, that doesn't happen, right? But again, if it does for you, great, simulate and see if it makes sense to change when that happens for you. The challenge with a higher starting repayment balance comes with the forgiven amounts, right? So here we see that pay as you earn will result in a forgiven balance that's quite high, over $500,000. We may even want to assume a little bit higher tax on that amount, depending on where you live and what those tax rates are at the time. So we can change that in the forgiveness planning module. I'm going to need to allocate a higher share of my income towards that forgiveness planning savings, right? So I'm going to need to allocate $670 a month in addition to what I'm paying towards my student loans in order to cover the forgiveness. But that's still going to be less expensive than trying to pay it off faster, because we're talking about 5 times, 6 times as much in order to pay that balance to zero. And that's going to cost you more than $100,000 than it would under income-driven repayment. If the starting balance gets high enough, sometimes it makes sense to look at revised pay as you earn over pay as you earn, even if you qualify for pay as you earn. So this is one of those instances where revised pay as you earn can be a better choice than pay as you earn, is when you're at the higher end of the spectrum on the starting repayment balance, right? Because it extends your repayment period out a little bit longer. It also comes with an unpaid interest subsidy, which is nice, right? But generally isn't enough to eclipse the pay as you earn, except in those higher starting repayment balance scenarios. Right, so that can help to reduce the tax, the amount that you have to save for the tax, but it generally will increase your total repayment cost because you're in repayment longer. Right, it's still a pretty good deal from an effective interest rate standpoint, but that's a tough decision. Right, that's going to be one that you're going to have to think about. in terms of where do I see my career going? That might not be a question you can answer right now, right? So you can choose pay as you earn or revise pay as you earn. Either one is fine to get started. But as you start to see your career unfold and you have a better understanding of what your income looks like, then you may settle on one versus the other shortly after getting started. So, this always comes up. So I see a question in here about, is there a possibility that you could get kicked off of the pay-as-you-earn repayment plan in the future? I hope so, right? And this is, I think I don't know where that necessarily comes from, but generally speaking, there's a test, an income test, and I'll use the one that we have up here to demonstrate this. But in order for you to be eligible for an income-driven repayment plan, the payment that you make under an income-driven plan has to be less than it would be under a standard 10-year plan, right? So your income in this case, in order to generate a payment under pay-as-you-earn or revised pay-as-you-earn of this amount has to be staggering, right? So congratulations when that happens. So in this particular case, your income probably has to be over $500,000 a year before you would no longer be eligible for a payment based on your income. And in that case, they will set your payment to this number, right? So now your payment is less than 10% of your income because your income generates a payment that is higher than it would be under pay-as-you-earn. And I can go back up here and try to figure out what that is. But let's say some magical scenario existed where you could earn $500,000 after your internship in veterinary medicine, and your income increased at 3.5%. And I'll take the spouse out of this one just for giggles, just to demonstrate this point. Take the children out too. Just that easy, right? Getting rid of kids. So we'll run your simulation, and here we can see that you end up tracking the standard 10-year plan soon after your income reaches that level, right? So after that first year, it gets set to $38.95, right? If you were to use revised pay-as-you-earn, this is what it would be at 10% of your income, right? So this is where we see revised pay-as-you-earn actually end up being a little bit less sometimes than pay-as-you-earn, because it tracks 10% of your discretionary income no matter what it is. It doesn't actually cap it at this standard 10-year amount. But your income has to be $500,000 or more in this case, right? So run that simulation, right? If you hit that point where they tell you that, sorry, we can't base your income, we can't base your payment on your income anymore because you're earning too much. Well, what a great problem to have, right? Then you'll pay the standard 10-year amount, and you'll either pay your balance to zero or you'll hit forgiveness depending on when that happens, right? So don't worry about that whole will I qualify for it in the future thing. If your income increases past that point, then congratulations. I see another question in here that for somebody that has about $385,000 of debt, so higher than what we have here, that is planning on taking over a father's practice, and then in 5 years might be earning $200,000, right? So that's not going to be enough to justify not using income-driven repayment, right? You'll pay more towards your student loans, but it'll probably still be the least expensive option, right? And you can actually model that, right? So let's say that we have that scenario. Let's try to get to something that's close to 300 and there we go. Something close to 385,000. We'll get rounded up to 6.5 when you consolidate, and we'll do that auto pay discount to take a quarter point off. We'll leave the internship out. This is a little bit harder to project, but I can fudge it, right? So let's say if we plan on taking on practice ownership in 5 years, I can use the internship and residency fields to say what my income is going to be in those first 5 years. So let's say it's going to be 85,000 for 2 years, and maybe it's going to be 95,000 for 3 years. And then I'm going to earn $200,000, and I'll increase that at 3.5% thereafter, right? So now I've built myself an income projection that can accommodate that first 5 years plus the increase in income after being a practice owner. I'm going to run that simulation, and I can see here that pay as you earn, right? This question, this person is concerned that pay as you earn would be a bad choice to get started with, even in that scenario. And the loan repayment simulator will show us for a single person that you're still going to pay the same amount as you would under a standard 10-year plan, but you're paying it over 20 years, and you're using a much smaller percent of your income in order to do that, right? And if we factor in the forgiveness plan, well, now we've just saved $40,000 over that standard 10-year plan, right? So it still makes the most sense to get started and stay in income-driven repayment even after your income increases. In this case, I would say significantly, right? If I started out with an $85,000 income and 5 years later I'm earning more than $200,000, that's a significant increase. But the way that the income-driven repayment plans are built and the amount of debt that we can come out of veterinary school with still dictates that paying based on your income, paying the minimum, and planning for the forgiveness is going to save you the most amount of money and also give you the most amount of cash flow flexibility during that time. That person would end up paying the effective interest rate of about 2% per year on their student loans, which is a pretty damn good deal, right? So don't leave money on the table, even if you expect your income to increase. And great, I'm glad if your income is going to increase, that's outstanding. But it doesn't necessarily mean you should automatically be throwing more towards your student loans than your income actually requires. Let me go back. I got off on a little bit of a tangent there. So we did cover, the accountant plus the simulator. So when you're married, it's going to help to have a good accountant, and you're going to have to use a simulator to bring back to the accountant to justify why you want to file your taxes separately, because they're going to look at you like a puppy does when you make a squeaky noise, right? Because they're not going to understand why you're going to want to pay more in taxes, but you're going to have to tell them that it's because you're going to save $100,000 or more on your student loans. Revised pay as you earn is a little bit different, right? So revised pay as you earn is not nearly as flexible as pay as you earn. However, and that's because you have to provide your spouse's income documentation. Even if you file your taxes separately, they won't let you exclude your spouse's income unless you're separated or going through a divorce, and there's no way for you to reasonably provide your spouse's income documentation. So that's one of the reasons why pay as you earn is generally better than revised pay as you earn. It's because you don't get that flexibility to separate your income from your spouse. We've talked about auto pay. You want to set up that automatic monthly debit once you're in repayment, even if you have a $0 payment, right? So I see a lot of folks who are not using this, right? This is just free money. All you have to do is set up an account, make sure there's enough money in it for them to take out that minimum monthly payment, and you'll get that 0.25 interest rate reduction. There's really no reason not to do that. It'll save you money over time. This is an active process, right? So the days of setting and forgetting your student loan repayment plan are long gone, right? So income-driven repayment requires activity on your part. Every year, you're going to have to provide them taxable income documentation for them to continue basing your payment on your income. If you're married and you file your taxes separately, they won't finish the application or the renewal until your spouse provides that documentation and signs the application. So there's a lot that you have to make sure that you get done. It's a little bit like filing your taxes every year, but we all get used to doing that. When you earn income in this society, you have to file your taxes, otherwise there's consequences. If you don't set reminders and provide your annual income documentation, there's also going to be consequences for your student loans. Right? So if you fail to renew on time, or your loan servicer fails to process this stuff on time, they will take any of the unpaid interest that you accrued and they will add it to your principal, right? That's not something that you want to have happen. Your payment will also revert to that standard 10-year plan payment. So that can be quite a shock if you go from paying zero to paying something close to thousands of dollars a month all of a sudden, right? So make sure that they process that documentation on time. Okay, so let's spend a little bit of time thinking beyond our student loans, right? So one of the reasons why I want you to consolidate, get that $0 payment, enter income-driven repayment for those first 12 months is so you can get your financial plan started, right? So this is a really chaotic time. You're learning how to become a veterinarian, right? But you're also going to be earning income, which is great, right? So welcome to the income earning population. It's nice to be not to be a student for a while. So you have choices that you're going to have to make of what you're going to do with that income. And I see a lot of recent graduates, because they're all of a sudden earning more money than they've ever had before, their first thought is to put all of their extra towards their student loans. Not the best place to put that, right? So you have a lot of other things that you can concentrate on first. Build an emergency fund, right? Target 3 to 6 months of your gross income so you don't have to carry credit card debt. A lot of you are graduating with credit card debt, right? I know, because as part of your loan history and signalment, you tell me that you have credit card debt, right? And it doesn't matter what it is, how you got it, how much it is. Use this time that you're earning income to pay it down, right? Use that $0 payment for your student loans for the first 12 months to take care of some of that less flexible debt first, like your credit card debt. Your credit card debt, even though it's a smaller number than your student loans, never takes a backseat to your student loans. You have this enormous flexibility to pay based on your income on your student loans. You don't have that same ability with your credit card debt. Pay that stuff off as fast as you can, right? You'll be better for it in the long run. You'll have more money to work with. Build that emergency fund so you don't have to carry credit card debt anymore in the future. And then also start and build your retirement plan. Don't leave free money on the table, even if you're in an internship, right? If you have some extra money during that internship, put it in an IRA, right? Don't put it towards your student loans, particularly if your income doesn't require it, right? Your future self is going to be much better for it and better financially off for it. So start building your retirement savings. Target 10% of your gross. You may not be able to get there right away, but work up towards that amount. If your employer offers a 401k, particularly with a match, take advantage of that. At least contribute the amount that they're going to match up to, right? That's free money. So don't leave that on the table. You're also going to need some money if you want to buy a home, buy a practice, right? So that income-driven repayment can help free up some cash flow for that. Kids are expensive. Families are expensive. You're going to need money. Don't put it all towards your student loans. If you're using income-driven repayment and the loan repayment simulator shows that you're going to hit forgiveness, then plan for it. You have 20, 25 years, depending on the plan that you're using. Use that time to your advantage, right? So start stashing away whatever you can to meet that anticipated tax that's due when you reach it. And enjoy life, right? If you can certainly take every emergency shift that you can find available to you if you love being in a veterinary practice, but don't do it because you want to pay your loans off, right? You're probably going to end up paying more than you have to. Even if you are working those extra shifts, do something else with that money, right? Pay what your income requires towards your student loans and start working on all of these other areas that we generally consider to be financially beneficial. Just a word on forgiveness planning, right? Get started. The earlier, the better, right? So you have that forgiveness planning module that will give you a target. Let's go back and take a peek at that. In this particular instance, this is the person who's going to take over the family veterinary practice and experience the increase in income. It's still going to require about a $450 monthly contribution in an account to cover that tax that's due 20 years from now under pay as you earn. Right? So we can use that forgiveness planning module to give us a ballpark of how to start planning for that. Then where are we going to put it? Right? So usually you can start to just build it in a savings account, use some resources I'll share with you in a second. I have some online savings accounts that are earning 2.5%, right? And those are pretty safe, right? But if you want to treat this more like a retirement investment, right, and be a little more aggressive with it, you can assume maybe a little bit higher return. That will decrease the amount that you need to save, right? But this is also more risky, right? So you have to be a little bit careful about how much you subject your forgiveness plan to the whims, the ups and downs, the volatility of the stock market, right? So you don't want to be left in a recession right before you hit forgiveness and then have a lot of your forgiveness plan exposed to something that goes down 20% the year before you need it. So you have to be a little bit careful with that. But at the same time, you do have a long time planning horizon. So some of those principles apply, but there's probably a happy medium in there somewhere. So start with an online savings account. Bankrate.com, nerdwallet.com will help you identify those areas where you can open an online savings account and earn a relatively high percent for just stashing your money somewhere. And once you have a little bit stashed away, then you can start to think about what you might do next with it, right? So that's where we can lean on some of those retirement savings principles. You may even enlist the help of a certified financial planner that you can pay to help you manage that forgiveness plan for you. But the difference here is, and we talked about this briefly, is that your forgiveness funds, they're needed on a specific date, right? So this is where it differs from the retirement savings concepts, is that, if I say that I want to retire at 65 and I don't quite have enough money to do that, I can either choose to keep working or I can adjust my retirement living situation, right, to match how much I do have saved. When you hit forgiveness, the IRS is going to want their money, right? You don't have the opportunity to say, sorry, I want to postpone that, or is there a way for me to do this some other time, right? You have to have that money on hand. Otherwise, there's going to be some consequences that are going to be very unpleasant to deal with when you tell the IRS that you don't have the money that they're expecting.
Tony, we're getting a lot of questions about private loans. If you can just speak to that.
Yeah, sure. What kind of questions about private loans?
How do you go about paying them back?
So private loans, the first step, if you have private loans with your federal student loans, is to get your federal student loans into income-driven repayment at the lowest amount that your income can justify, right? So if that's a $0 payment for the first 12 months, now you've got 12 months that you can work towards paying off those private loans. I kind of treat the private loans like I do credit cards, honestly, because they're less flexible, right? They don't often have the opportunity for you to defer them or have them adjusted based on your income. They have the potential to put you into default if you should experience a prolonged period of not earning any income, right? So anything that you can do to pay those off faster or as fast as your income allows, I would take advantage of that. Refining them, so a private refi of private loans, if you can do it, right? Most of you, by virtue of the fact that you just graduated and you're now entering the earning population, are not going to be great candidates for refinancing your student loans, right? So you may not get those stellar interest rates that are advertised on the envelope that they're mailing you. Those are just to get you to call. Now, if you can, wonderful, right? But make sure that you understand the terms and conditions of that loan and whether or not they're requiring somebody to co-sign on your behalf, right? So that's also a little bit risky. But that really, it just comes down to allocation of resources. And if you have the option of minimizing your federal student loan payment based on your income, then you can allocate more of your earnings towards something like private loans if you can pay them down sooner rather than later.
A couple more questions that we're getting multiple of is one, how often can you switch your repayment plan?
Switching repayment plans, right? So generally speaking, switching repayment plans is not a great idea. So if you need to, I would, limit it to one time maybe, right? So in that scenario where I described, maybe you're on the fence between revised pay-as-you-earn and pay-as-you-earn, you would, if you determine that you chose the wrong one, you would want to make that switch once. Another example is maybe I chose revised pay-as-you-earn. I didn't plan on getting married and now I did, and I don't want my spouse's income to count towards my student loan payment, and I can't do that under revised pay-as-you-earn, so now I'm going to switch to pay-as-you-earn or IBR. Okay, that's another one-time switch. The consequences of switching are if you have unpaid interest, they will capitalize your interest, right? So it will get added to your principal balance, which means you'll pay more than you would have if you didn't have to switch, right? If you would have started with that repayment plan from the get-go. So, and there's really no, other than those very specific circumstances, right? So you're in repay and you can't file your taxes separately, and you want to use a plan that does allow you to file separately. Yes, that makes sense. My wife and I switched from IBR to repay because repay wasn't available, right? And then it became available, but the same consequences happened. We had unpaid interest. It got capitalized when we switched from IBR to repay, but we used the simulator and it still made sense financially for us to switch. Ideally, we would have been able to start and repay if it had been available, and it would have cost us less than factoring in that switch, right? So even if your income increases to a point where it doesn't make sense, or your payment is no longer based on your income, it doesn't make sense to switch repayment plans, right? You would stay in the same repayment plan and choose to pay more if it made sense, but you would stick in the repayment plan that you picked if your income dictated that you should pay more, right? So there shouldn't be a lot of switching that goes on. Use this time that you have now, right, while you're researching your repayment options, using the My Student Loans tool, using the loan repayment simulator to choose the most beneficial option available to you and stick with that one, right? Generally, that's going to be pay as you earn, right? Except for those instances that we've already covered tonight, because pay as you earn is the most flexible. Right? So even if you're not married yet and you get married in the future and you do or don't want to include your spouse's income in the calculation, you have that ability under pay as you earn. It's also the shortest repayment period of an income-driven plan. So that's why starting in pay as you earn is usually never a bad choice. But there can be those instances where revised pay as you earn might be a better option for you if you fall into one of those exceptions that we've mentioned tonight.
Another question, which is one of your favorites, which is, how does student loan debt affect your ability to secure a loan for purchasing a home in the future?
Absolutely. So I think that, and we covered this a little bit when we talked about buying a practice, right? So buying a practice or buying a home, the bank is going to look at whether or not you are a risk to offer a loan to. If you're using a standard plan, and you're trying to pay 20, 30, 40% of your income towards your student debt payment each month, you're one accident away from losing everything, right? So they're not going to offer you a loan for a home or a practice, right? If you have a manageable payment, like you can using your income-driven repayment plan, having a payment that's a fixed percentage of your after-tax, or not your after-tax, but your taxable income. So 10% of your discretionary income, which is based on your taxable income, that payment towards your student debt is always a manageable percentage of your income. Whether you think it is or not, it's technically a manageable percent, right? 10% of your discretionary income is a pretty small number, right? But if you're paying an amount, or your minimum is an amount that is higher than that, well, that's going to change the game, right? So now you're going to look like a riskier borrowing candidate. You're probably not going to get offered a loan, depending on how high of a percentage all of your expenses are of your gross income. But I will, just to share a story, my wife and I already told you guys that, we have more than $400,000 of student loans, and we bought a home in Denver here a few years ago, and we went to apply for that loan. And I was all set for them to give us a reason why they couldn't give us the loan because of our student loans, and it never happened, right? They saw our credit reports. They pulled our credit reports. We have excellent credit scores. They saw a manageable percent that we were in good standing on because we've been making on-time payments, the required payments based on our income, and they offered us a stellar interest rate and never even asked us a question about our student loans. Right? So you can be a better borrowing candidate to a lender using these income-driven plans than you can if you're trying to pay your loans faster than your income actually allows you to do.
Another couple of questions. Do you know when to how do you know when to renew every year? Will their website list it, and do they send reminders?
Yes. So every year, so you're kind of you're on almost an anniversary system. So let's say you consolidate your student loans and your consolidation completes in July, right? And you enter repayment in July. you're going to be due to renew your income documentation again before the next July. And that renewal window will open about 60 days before that anniversary date. So if your anniversary date is in July, then you're going to be looking around May to start sending them your income documentation. You should get reminders from them, but don't count on that, right? I mean, depending on your email system or the email that they have on file and whether or not it ends up in your spam, make sure you set some more reliable reminders and don't just rely on their reminders to submit that. Because if you blow through that renewal window, they'll capitalize your interest and they'll set your payment to that standard 10-year. You can get it back into income-driven repayment again. It's just going to take some time, and you may end up having to pay a couple of months worth of payments, or they'll put your loans in forbearance, and then you'll end up having more interest capitalized. So you want to avoid that to the extent possible.
Okay, another question that we're getting a few of the same, and just to confirm that, so for the period during the 0 per month repayment period, you actually do not pay nothing at all, anything at all for a year.
Absolutely. Yeah, especially if you have a $0 payment, and again, use the loan repayment simulator. If it shows that you're going to end up hitting forgiveness, that $0 payment will decrease your total loan repayment costs. So there's no reason to pay anything, right? You can start your forgiveness plan, right? That would be a good use of that extra income, right? So if you don't have to tackle credit card debt, you don't have any private loans to take care of, you've already started your emergency fund, you can start to allocate some resources towards that forgiveness plan, right? It's still better to pay the minimum, even if the minimum is 0, and plan for the forgiveness if you're projected to hit forgiveness, right? I know that's a kind of a funny concept because it's kind of hard to know whether you're going to hit forgiveness, especially since you really haven't practiced a year yet in veterinary medicine. But as that situation unfolds, you'll start to see quite quickly that you'll have more budgetary flexibility, and it's quite likely that you're still on the path towards hitting forgiveness. Again, until or unless your income appreciably exceeds your student debt balance, in which case, congratulations, right? None of this stuff is really an issue anymore, right? So until your income gets to that point, pay the minimum, plan for the forgiveness if you're projected to hit it, and do some other things with your money. We've covered a lot of other opportunities for you to get started. That's really just scratching the surface, but there's 100 other things that you can do with your money before you should think about putting it towards your student loans if you're projected to hit forgiveness.
And what if you are not projected to hit forgiveness and it projects that you will overpay $50,000 less with standard 10-year versus PE?
Yeah, so that means that your simulation is extremely sensitive to your income, right? So I would want to know what my income is going to do, or feel better or more confident about what my income is going to do in the subsequent years, right? So I'd still use income-driven repayment to start. And if I start to see that, yes, I have a pretty good feel for what my income is, and if my payment is starting to approach what that standard 10-year payment is, then I might consider paying a little bit more per month towards my student loans. Because if I'm going to end up not hitting forgiveness, any little bit that I can pay extra towards my student loans is going to reduce the time that I'm in repayment, which is going to decrease my total repayment costs. Right? It doesn't mean that you should all of a sudden jump up to the standard 10-year payment, right? Because you don't want to ignore all of those other areas of your financial wellness plan. It just becomes more of a balance, right? So making sure that I'm allocating resources to all of those other areas of my financial plan, and then if I still have a little bit extra left and I'm not projected to hit forgiveness, then I might pay a little bit more towards my student loans. I'm still going to probably keep them in the federal student loan system because I want that flexibility in case something should happen, right? I mean, again, we're doing the best we can simulating our income, and you may have noticed that we simulate persistent increases. That may not be reality, right? You may experience, quite likely will experience, some blips in the road where your income may decrease, right? In those cases, I want to have the flexibility, the option to decrease my monthly payment towards my student loans based on that decreased income if I should experience it, right? And if that increases my total loan repayment costs a little bit, so be it. Think of it as insurance, right? I mean, I had some insurance against not having to be in the awkward position of paying more than my income would allow towards my student debt, which makes me flirting with delinquency and default, which can really, really change your credit score and ability to buy things in the future. Also is really hard to get out of.
Okay, another question, which is, will public service loan forgiveness be around in 10 years, 25 years? It's definitely a question that a lot of people are asking.
Yeah, public service loan forgiveness. So I didn't dedicate a slide specifically to public service loan forgiveness, but I can give you the 3 requirements, right? So that having direct loans, right? So you have only payments made towards direct loans are eligible for public service loan forgiveness, right? So that's another reason why you should consolidate your student loans right out of the gate, right? Especially if you have those health profession student loans, Perkins loans, older school Fell loans, any of those non-direct federal student loans. Get them into a federal direct consolidation loan because that would make them eligible for public service loan forgiveness. Using an income-driven repayment plan. You have to be making payments under an income-driven repayment plan to meet the second checkbox of public service loan forgiveness. The third checkbox is working for a nonprofit entity, a 501c3 state, federal, tribal government organization as an employee and meeting the full-time employment standards. So at least 30 hours per week. So as long as you're meeting those minimum requirements, the right employer, full-time, 30 hours per week, using income-driven repayment and making payments on direct loans, you are making eligible public service loan forgiveness payments. You're going to want to submit a public service loan forgiveness employment certification form. That will double check with the Department of Education that you're doing all of the right things, right? There's a part on there for you to fill out. There's a part on there for your employer to fill out. They will tell you whether or not you're making those eligible payments. Then they will start the clock ticking, right? So Fed Loan Servicing will have your loans. They will start counting down the number of qualifying payments that you've made. And once you've made 120 qualifying monthly payments, you're eligible to apply to have your loans forgiven. We've just passed the first cohort of folks who are able to do that, and it didn't go well, right? But there was a lot of reasons for that. And most of them had to do with the fact that there weren't a lot of income-driven options available when the plan was first released. And there were a lot of other loan types out there other than direct loans that people didn't know that they had to consolidate in a specific way in order to be making eligible payments towards eligible loans. So it wasn't much of a surprise to anybody who was looking at the student loan system to see that almost no one qualified for public service loan forgiveness. But we will see way more people qualify in the future because it's become much easier as the tracking mechanisms have become better and as we've phased out a lot of those non-direct loans. So you're going to see more people qualify for public service loan forgiveness, and nobody is proposing to get rid of it for folks who are already in repayment or who have already borrowed direct loans, right? So that is going to be eligible for all of those folks that have already borrowed under those contractual arrangements. They may phase it out in the future for folks who haven't started borrowing yet, but they're going to honor the contracts that have already been written. We've got 44 million loan contracts out there that have public service loan forgiveness baked into them. So it would be highly unlikely for them to tear up those 44 million loan contracts without some significant blowback. So, which is why nobody proposes to do that. They all propose to create a new system where they would phase that out for folks who haven't borrowed yet and would borrow under a new system that might exclude something like public service loan forgiveness. But again, none of that has actually happened yet and may never happen. So you can pretty much count on public service loan forgiveness being there. I don't get to make the rules, but I do read the contracts, and those contracts are pretty strong. And there is, again, nobody proposing to get rid of those plans for anybody who is currently in repayment or has federal direct loans. I see Dr. Wilson has joined us and has some comments in there. A lot of good stuff from him. All of these plans require incredible self-discipline to save significant money on a monthly basis, or the tax on the forgiven debt will be a huge problem. Yeah, absolutely. I think that that does have the potential to be a huge problem, right? Just as we've seen kind of the blowback of you know, the people who thought they'd be eligible for public service loan forgiveness find out that they were doing the wrong things. I think there's going to be a lot of people who end up using income-driven repayment, and the tax sneaks up on them, right? They're going to be like, oh, well, nobody told me that I was going to have to owe this much to the IRS, or I never would have done this. And it's like, well, it's written right there in the rules. And I don't want anybody that I come across to be in that position, right? Anybody that signed up for this, all of the students that I get a chance to talk to, all of the veterinarians that I get a chance to talk to, I make it painfully obvious that there is a tax liability that will be incurred if their payments do not cover all of their student debt and they reach the maximum repayment period. That's in the student loan repayment simulator. We've got a forgiveness planning module to help you understand that. We talk about that ad nauseum on the VIN student debt folder. That's a lot of the questions that come up is how do I plan for the tax, right? So at least I know that the folks that we talk to know that it exists and that you should be taking the steps necessary to plan for it. But I can't do it for you, right? So this is where the discipline part that Dr. Wilson mentions comes in. I mean, you have to make this a part of your financial plan. I've talked to some other folks who are like, oh yeah, well, we had a forgiveness plan, but we had to tap into it to replace our roof. Your forgiveness plan is not your roof repair fund, right? That's a different fund. You're going to have a separate roof repair fund than your forgiveness planning fund, right? You're going to need to have this on hand. Otherwise, there's going to be consequences, right? You're going to have to come up with some kind of repayment plan to the IRS. There's going to be penalties and interest on top of that. And you're just dragging this out longer than you need to, right? You have enough time and hopefully enough resources at your disposal to adequately plan for that forgiveness in 20 or 25 years. Take advantage of that. Ask lots of questions. There's a lot of us that are out there trying to help you meet that goal so you don't end up in that position that a lot of folks are going to be in that says, oh, I didn't know, right? And I don't think there's going to be a lot of remedy for that, or at least not yet. We'll see what happens. 2032 will be the first year that we see a significant number of folks actually hit the taxable version of forgiveness. And then, you know, where we are in society at that time will kind of determine how we treat those folks. Are we going to penalize them further, or are we going to come up with some kind of way of helping them alleviate some of that financial stress? I have no idea what the answer to that question is going to be. Only time is going to tell. So just to wrap this up, so best advice I can give you, right? Get on that NSLDS, download that student data file, upload it into the VIN Foundation My Student Loans tool. If your debt exceeds your income, consolidate, end your grace period, apply for income-driven repayment. Generally, that's going to be pay as you earn, but repay can make sense in certain circumstances. Pay the minimum, plan for the forgiveness, and make sure you're renewing on time. There's no reason to defer or forbear your loans. Call them up, send in documentation. If you're going on unpaid maternity leave, you're moving, you don't have any income, you can have your payment adjusted to zero in those cases. These are just some other ones I'll throw out there in case we didn't address them tonight and anybody has a burning desire to talk about them now. I can see that I failed miserably at my hour goal, as tends to be the case when it comes to student loan repayment. But I know that you all are entering this loan repayment world now, and since it's becoming real soon, I know that you have more questions associated with that. So I'm going to try to work through some of these, and to the extent that we haven't answered them, I'll maybe put together a document that we can post alongside the recording of this session to answer those more directly. I'll even try to email you directly with some of the answers to these questions as well. But continue to post them in there. I'm going to kind of scroll through them now, but I don't have any other material to add specifically other than to cover some of the questions and to thank Jordan for arranging this behind the scenes and also kind of moderating the questions both here and on the Facebook stream, where we also have this streaming live. So
we will also be sending everyone email with a link to a recording, and also be sending out a PDF checklist, which we've not done before, but we're going to give it a shot with a checklist of information to sort of help guide you through the process. And hopefully that'll help as well. And Tony, if it's helpful, I can read some of these for you. But
yeah, great. I'm gonna jump on right here that came in a little bit earlier about the download. When I download my loan info, it downloads in a CVS format, but in order to upload it, it has to be in a text form. Any advice for how to do this? So I suspect that you may have gotten that CVS format from studentloans.gov and not nslds.ed.gov. Try the NSLDS website. As far as I'm aware, if you do that, if you go through the NSLDS site directly and you click on that My Student Data download, it only generates in a text file. Now, if you have some kind of device that lives somewhere between a laptop and a tablet, then you may have some other type of file that it tries to download. In that case, we may have to get a little bit more creative in terms of getting that NSLDS file. But if you can find a desktop or you can find a laptop and go visit the NSLDS site, you should be able to download that as a text file. That CSV file usually only downloads in that studentloans.gov, which is another area you can download your student data. But we don't have the ability to work with that CSV file yet, but we may do that in the future if more and more folks are getting their data from that source.
And she was able to fix that.
Okay, great. Excellent.
So one question is, I have $100,000 or less. I'm wanting to pursue a lab animal combined PhD program that will take an additional 5 years to complete after veterinary school. Is it possible to pay off loans during this time? I just don't want interest to accumulate.
Yeah, so that's another great example where repay is probably going to be your best friend, right? So revised pay as you earn comes with a unpaid interest subsidy. So during that 5-year period where you're earning minimal income, right? So 30 to 50 grand a year or whatever you're able to get in that lab animal residency education, you can have their minimum determined based on your income, and then the government will cover half of that interest during that time. And then once you get done, the lab animal vets, if you get board certified as a lab animal vet, your income will exceed your debt, right? So you can continue on and repay. And if you continue paying 10% of your income, your payment will be higher than the standard 10-year amount. And you'll probably pay your loans to zero, still within that total 10-year time frame, maybe a couple years later. So maybe it'll take you 12 years from the time you graduate till the time you pay your loans to zero, if that all goes as planned. I think that would be perfectly reasonable to pay your loans back over 12 years, let the government cover half of the interest while you're doing that advanced education, and then start making payments based on that higher income once you finish that advanced education. You can also model that in the student loan repayment simulator, and you'll see how that'll work out for you. But there's probably no reason to make payments above what your income requires while you're using repay in that situation.
Okay, another question is, my school offers an income shared agreement plan. Would this be a smart way to go to fund the rest of my veterinary school education, 2 more years with tuition of $20,000 a year?
Ooh, that I would have to see more details of that. I'm not familiar with that. I think I know what school that is, but I would have to see some more information around that particular person's situation and that income share arrangement.
Okay. Would you recommend for new grads to go into an internship?
Ooh, that's a whole different lecture. That's a tough one, right? It depends on what you want to do after the internship, right? So internship economics is another thing I'm really passionate about, but we've already done 2 hours tonight. So I think that's a question that goes beyond the scope of what we're doing tonight. If you think that it's going to help you earn more income and you don't see another way of achieving that same position without doing the internship, then I would say go for it. But there's, something like 70% of all veterinary graduates don't do internships, right? So internships are not necessary, but they are extremely helpful in very specific circumstances, like obtaining a residency or maybe working in ER, in urgent care, right? It's not necessarily required there, but it does help. So it really depends on what you're planning to do after that internship.
If my parents co-signed my initial loans, will they be off the hook when I reconsolidate if I no longer need a co-signer?
I'd have to see the specifics of those loans. I'm not sure if they're talking about private student loans there, or if they're talking about the direct parent plus loans, which you would not be able to consolidate in the federal direct consolidation loan, right? So that I'd have to know a little bit more about that specific situation in terms of that person's specific loan types and the loans that their parents are co-signers on.
Okay.
So that would be one where you would want to reach out to us via email.
My Perkins loans isn't listed under income-driven repayment. Will it be counted once I consolidate?
Once you consolidate that Perkins loan, it will be eligible to be paid using the income-driven repayment plans.
Can you waive your grace period if planning to do a public service loan forgiveness?
Absolutely, and you should, because your grace period doesn't count towards public service loan forgiveness. Only eligible payments count towards public service loan forgiveness, and the only way to make eligible payments is to end your grace period, apply for income-driven repayment, and get into repayment.
If we have some loans that are in forbearance, do you still recommend consolidation of these with others that are in grace and in deferment?
Absolutely. So if you have other loans that have previously been in repayment and are now in some kind of in-school deferment or forbearance while you're finishing up veterinary school, consolidate those as well, because then you'll get them on the same repayment time frame as your other loans, and you'll only have to make that or submit your income documentation, and it'll be applied to all of those loans equally because it'll be part of that same consolidation loan. You might, if you have older loans that have already used up their grace period, the only thing that you want to be careful on is that they're going to go into repayment immediately after you graduate, right? So once those loans know that you've graduated, you're going to have a payment due on them again within like 30 days of graduation. So you can call them up and tell them, hey, I'm gonna put these in my federal direct consolidation loan, and then they'll keep them in forbearance for an extra little bit of time while that consolidation processes. Otherwise, you would be responsible for making minimum payments on those older loans while the consolidation is completing.
A couple of questions that we get a lot. Do you have any information on how we can make physical appointments with financial officers and income-based that know about income-based repayment plans that are credible?
Yeah, that's a tough one. There really aren't a lot out there. So you're going to have to interview them, right? Like your clients are going to interview you, right? They expect a certain level of service for their animal. And if they get the sense that you're not the right person or have the right experience for their animal, then they're going to look elsewhere. You should do the same thing with financial planners, right? Ask them questions. How often have they dealt with folks with income-driven repayment? Do they even know what it is, right? If you start talking about pay-as-you-earn or revised pay-as-you-earn, and again, they tilt their head sideways, like when you make a squeaky toy in front of a puppy, then you're going to probably want to look elsewhere, right? We don't have a real good list of folks that we can recommend for you yet. We hope that we can start building something like that, but until you do, a lot of this is to help you understand enough to know what questions to ask folks like financial professionals to see if you're actually getting good advice.
And if we're not answering any of your questions, or if you guys have more specific questions, you can always email studentdebt@vinfoundation.org, or there will be a link that will be sending you guys an email, and you can also go on to that blog post and submit your question there as well.
Right.
Just looking to see if there's anything specific that...
I see a question I just want to address here. Qualifications for forgiveness. Now that's a bit of a loaded question, right? Because there's two different types of forgiveness. There's public service loan forgiveness, which we've talked about the qualifications for, right? So you have to be making payments using income-driven repayment on direct loans while working for an eligible employer. Then you can apply to have your loans forgiven, and there's no tax on that, right? So if they forgive your loans under public service loan forgiveness, there is no tax. If you make the maximum payments under an income-driven plan, like pay-as-you-earn, which you're allowed to do for 20 years, and you still have a balance remaining, they will forgive the remainder, and that remainder will be reported to the IRS as taxable income. And you will have to pay tax on that. You don't have to apply for that kind of forgiveness. That will just happen, right? So it's strictly based on the clock that is ticking on your loans, the number of payments you've made under an income-driven plan. And when you hit the maximum repayment period, 20 years under pay-as-you-earn, 25 years under revised pay-as-you-earn, and if there's a balance remaining, your loans will get forgiven automatically, right? You don't have to apply for it. You don't get to deny it. It just will happen. And then you'll have to navigate the tax consequences of that when it happens.
So someone made a comment saying that they met with a financial advisor and that they learned that they could decrease their discretionary income for income-driven repayment plans by increasing monthly contributions to a retirement annuity account.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And that's great advice, right? That's where the intersection between doing other things outside of your student loans comes into play, right? There are incentives in the tax code to help you save for things like retirement, right? And they do that by not taxing you on some of the income that you stash away in certain retirement plans. So if you don't have to pay tax on that, then it's not counted as taxable income, right? Your discretionary income is based on your taxable income, right? So if you contribute more towards a tax advantaged or a pre-tax retirement account, your taxable income decreases, which means your monthly student loan payment decreases as well. So you're helping yourself in two different ways there. You're saving for retirement. You're also decreasing the amount that gets paid towards your student loans. And if you're going to hit forgiveness, you'll end up paying less in total towards your student loans. So you have a double benefit to save for retirement under the tax code, as well as the income-driven repayment rules. So that is some great advice.
So there's one here from someone about a question about the U.S. Army. Is there a way to use the simulator to take into account the payoff amounts from the U.S. Army? What I mean is that my contract says they will pay off $120,000 of my loan for the next 3 years. Now I'm trying to figure out which payment plan is best.
And I would still, again, lean towards the income-driven plans. You may have to report those contributions towards your student loans as income. And if it's not enough to pay down your student debt entirely after those 3 years, I'm still want to use the income-driven repayment plans until I am in a position to know that I'm going to pay those loans off before I hit forgiveness. So I don't have a way to model that yet, right? We are working on a additional payment contribution feature to see what that would do to your student loan repayment plan. But again, until those payments are actually made towards my student loans, I don't want to pay any more than my income actually requires.
This is one we've gotten a couple of, which is, what if you have already filed last year as married jointly, and are you able to then file separately and change your repayment amount?
So let's say you filed your 2018 tax return as jointly, unless you go back and refile, you're not going to be able to separate your income from your spouse unless you refile, or until you file a new tax return in 2019 that might be a separate tax return, right? So you can change your tax filing status every year between joint and separate if you want. But your income-driven repayment amount is going to be based on how you filed your most recent tax return, right? So if your most recent tax return is 2018 and it says married filing jointly, then you're going to have to provide your spouse's income if you're applying for income-driven repayment now. Now, when you file your taxes in 2019, if you file them separately and your income now is lower because it's only your income instead of your and your spouse's income, then you can submit to have your payment recalculated based on the fact that your income is decreased, right? So when you have that new tax filing status on file, then you can resubmit your income documentation to have that payment recalculated.
Okay, this is another popular one that we get, which is, does federal consolidation also make your loans become a burden on your family in the event of your death, like private consolidation does?
That's actually one of the if you want to call it, great things about the federal student loans is they are never anybody else's responsibility, right? If the worst should happen to you, then your loans die with you, right? Nobody else is on the hook for covering your federal student loans. Even the most recent tax code changes made the Parent Plus loans dischargeable under death of the person who they borrowed it for. So that's not always the case with private student loans. Now, that said, some private student loans too will have a death discharge, but you have to negotiate it, right? You have to, one, know if it's in there or not in there and request it if it's not, right? So, and you have to be careful about the wording of it, right? So there's a lot of, so some of those private student loans are really messy, right? Some of them are, if you have a cosigner on the hook, they will become immediately due upon your death, and your family or whoever co-signed it has to pay it in full when that happens. And it's like, that's awful, right? None of that exists in the federal student loan system, which is another one of those reasons why you have to be really careful if you're going to take your federal student loans out of the federal system and replace it with a private loan, because those private loans are just not consistent, and it really depends on your ability to negotiate the most favorable terms possible.
Does interest accrue during the 12-month period using the IDR after consolidation with a 0-month minimum payment option?
Yes. So just like when I suggested that you use income-driven repayment during an internship or unpaid maternity leave, the interest still accrues. The difference is that when your income increases, that accrued interest doesn't get added to the principal, right? So that's the advantage of getting into repayment and then using income-driven repayment, is that unpaid interest will stay as unpaid interest, right? Your interest does not compound. After you enter repayment, your interest does not compound on your federal student loans, right? Which is another one of those reasons why it doesn't make sense to pay more than your income requires. A lot of people get confused. They're like, well, my student loan interest rate is 6.5%. I don't think I can earn that much in the stock market, so I'm going to pay more towards my student loans because it makes more financial sense. And that's actually completely incorrect. It's because your long-term investments compound, right? Your student loan interest does not compound, right? Your credit card interest might, right? Which is another reason why I encourage you to pay that off as fast as possible. But your student loan interest will not compound. You may accrue unpaid interest, but it accrues separately from your principal, and if you can keep it from getting added to your principal, you'll also greatly decrease your total student loan repayment costs.
Someone just asked, is that only for IVR?
Say that again.
Somebody just asked if that was only for IVR.
Well, it's for all the income-driven plans, right? So if your payment doesn't cover the interest, you will accrue unpaid interest, right? And Repay is the only income-driven plan that actually has an unpaid interest subsidy, right? So if you're paying, let's say your interest is $1,000 a month and your payment is $500 a month, your unpaid interest is $500 a month, right? Under Repay, the government pays $250 of that, right? So that's the unpaid interest subsidy. If you're not using Repay, if you're using Page One or IBR, then the full amount accrues, but it stays separate from your principal, right? As unpaid interest. You will have a principal balance and likely an unpaid interest balance in income-driven repayment. And you want to keep that unpaid interest as unpaid interest because it doesn't cost you any more until you reach forgiveness when you have to, pay the tax on that.
Can I sign up for payee before graduating?
Not before. Right? So you have to graduate, which is why we did this for graduates mostly, right? So it sounds like you're ahead of the game, or you haven't actually technically hit graduation yet. But once you do graduate, then you can start the consolidation process.
When you talk about planning on your student loans being forgiven with the IDR plan, does that only apply to vets who are working for the government nonprofit organizations?
Oh, that comes back to our differences between forgiveness, right? So public service loan forgiveness is extremely different than the taxable forgiveness under income-driven repayment, right? So if you work as a veterinarian for the government or for a nonprofit 501c3 and you're eligible for public service loan forgiveness, doing that for 10 years, you can have your federal student loans forgiven and not have to pay tax on it. If you make payments under income-driven repayment, payments based on your income, and you reach the maximum repayment periods under pay-as-you-earn, IBR, revised pay-as-you-earn, whatever's left will be forgiven, but you have to pay tax on that. And that's what the loan simulator is going to help you project, and then also, establish a baseline for helping you plan for that.
If you start off in payee and then either go over the 10% of income or your combined income with spouse goes over 10%, when you are enrolled in the standard 10-year payment, what happens to all the payments if you made in payee and the unpaid interest?
So it depends. So if that's where the partial financial hardship test comes in. If you have unpaid interest and you no longer meet the partial financial hardship test and your payment reverts to the standard 10-year, your unpaid interest can get capitalized. Now there it depends on which plan you're using. Under pay-as-you-earn, there's a maximum that can get added to your principal, and the maximum is equal to 10% of your starting repayment balance, which is another reason to consolidate as soon as you can because your starting repayment balance is lower. So that maximum threshold is lower. And it's another reason to use pay-as-you-earn is because it actually has a cap on the amount of unpaid interest that can get added to your principal. If you're using revised pay-as-you-earn, first of all, there's no partial financial hardship test. Your payment is always 10% of your discretionary income. So there's no opportunity for them to capitalize any unpaid interest. If you're in IBR and you no longer meet the partial financial hardship test, then they will add any unpaid interest balance to your principal, right? But there's generally no reason to use IBR if you have pay-as-you-earn or revised pay-as-you-earn at your disposal.
So two people are, one starting a job in 2 weeks, the other one just started a job last week. So the one that's starting the job in 2 weeks wants to make sure that they understand correctly. They can apply for consolidation now, but probably won't qualify for a zero payment per month. Is that correct?
Up to you. If your current income situation is zero, which it sounds like if you don't start your job for 2 weeks, your current income situation is zero, you can still get a $0 payment for the next 12 months, for the first 12 months. If you've already started your job, well, you're earning income, right? And you're going to have a paycheck soon, or about what that paycheck's going to be. So you'll probably want to provide that pay stub as documentation of your taxable income.
For the person that already started their job, would they want to take the grace period or start making payments now, even though they won't be zero?
No, that's okay if they're not zero. You can still get them to be a percent of your income, right? So, but in that case, if you have the ability to contribute to a retirement account, right? So if you have some pre-tax contributions you can make and have those show up in your pay stub too, or document that you're eligible for those, then you can decrease your taxable income and have your payment still be 10% of your discretionary income. It won't be zero, but it'll still get you into repayment, get the clock ticking, and start you on the path towards forgiveness if you anticipate hitting it. So just because you can't get the $0 payment doesn't mean you should let your grace period run out, right? Because you're still accruing interest, and any payments that you make during that period are not going to count towards anything other than maybe reducing your unpaid interest a little bit.
So this is a question that we got when we were at a recent school, which was about working less than 30 hours per week. How will that affect your student loan forgiveness requirements if you are working less than 30 hours per week? Or what are the hour limits?
That's only for public service loan forgiveness, right? So if you're an employee at an eligible public service loan forgiveness organization, then if you're not able to document at least an average of 30 hours per week, then you wouldn't be meeting those minimum public service loan forgiveness requirements. But if you're earning less, I mean, if you're working 30 hours per week and it's not a public service loan forgiveness eligible employment situation, then it really doesn't matter how much you're working. It's only going to be a function of your income. Presumably, if you're working less, you're earning less, right? So your payment would be based on that income.
Okay, I think we've got a bunch of these, and there's a couple more that we can still answer, but being respectful to the fact that we're almost at 2.5 hours.
Yeah, right. Well, and we can cover a lot of these and outside of this session as well. And you like, and as you laid out, I mean, you can email us at studentdebt@vinfoundation.org if you have any questions about how to get this started. Some of the questions that we're starting to get into are really dependent upon the specifics of your circumstance, so are probably better handled either via email or over on the VIN student debt folder, where we treat these like medical cases. You can even post your case anonymously, and we'll go into as much detail as you want, excruciating detail quite often. So, but as much detail as we need to get your questions answered.
And we will be sending out an email to everybody that registered with a link to a recording. There will be a blog post. We will also be sending out a PDF checklist. And if you have questions, the VIN student debt boards discussions, as well as the VIN Foundation blog post or the email. Huge thanks to everyone at VIN for helping and collaborating with us on this. And Tony, if you have anything else you want to say.
I do not. Just thank you all for the 40 so of you who stuck it out all the way to the end. I appreciate your patience and your engagement. And if you have any questions along the way here, please let us know and we'll do whatever we can to help.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you.